Well, Giles told me to talk about myself, actually, for a bit to start with today. But talking about myself is, of course, something I love to do. I'm sure you all love to do. It's this kind of thing that you do when you get into a psychiatrist's chair, or so I'm told. But the first thing I suppose I can say to you about myself is this, that I have spent the last 23 years meeting rapists and burglars and robbers and fraudsters and sex offenders of all sorts and terrorists and murderers. And I have the best possible job in the whole world, I would say. And although I'm going to talk about myself for a bit, I actually want to hear more about all of you. So I hope that you'll talk to me now about yourselves. And also later on over dinner, maybe I can talk to some of you. Now, Giles asked me to give you a quick rundown on how I came to be Senior Treasury Counsel, so I will. When I first graduated from St Andrews, where I'd been with Giles, I don't know if any of you know it, it's the most wonderful university up in Scotland, medieval town by the sea. We have a lot of American students there, and maybe some of you will go there. You would love it. But when I graduated, I was obviously going to be Prime Minister, and I had very few ideas about anything else that I might do in the meantime. If I wasn't going to be Prime Minister, on the way I was going to be some sort of entrepreneur. I had rather vague ideas about what entrepreneurs do, but I thought I was going to start up a business and make millions in some way. But beyond that, and my English literature degree, I had little idea about planning or about career progression or anything else. All I'd done to further this was to become president of the debating union, and I had the privilege of coming to Princeton University to represent my university in the World Debating Competition. And together with Giles, I'd indulged in a lot of student politics for the Conservative student wing, which is our equivalent of your Republicans. I have to say, if I lived in America today, I think I might fast be becoming a Democrat if I was given the choice of presidential candidate that you have. In any event, having done all of that, I had no plans. I had no place in a graduate training scheme or anything else. So I ended up joining a bank, the National Westminster Bank, only because it was the only institution that still had places left for graduates. So I did that for about 18 months. I got sent off to a seaside town on the south coast and had to spend time lending money to people running all people's homes and farmers, and found that quite tedious. I then joined a Japanese bank in the city, where the really interesting thing was being paid a vast amount of money for doing really very little indeed. But you know something? You may all find this, that life takes really unexpected twists and turns all the time. And nobody's life is ever going to be a sort of progression, from beginning to end. You can never decide at the beginning, I'm going to start by doing this, and I'm going to end up doing that, and on the way I'll collect this number of children, and this wife, or this husband, and this position in life. It all changes. So I found that while earning a lot of money was really, really interesting, nothing else about this work was interesting at all. The only other interesting thing was I met my future husband while I was working there, and that was quite fun. So I then switched and I went to work for a British merchant bank, and that was a bit more interesting. I spent a lot of time traveling in Scandinavia. But again, I found that the only really interesting thing was the money. I wasn't very good at what I was doing. And earning a lot was great, but you really cannot live a life on doing a job you're not good at, and if you're not good at it, you won't enjoy it. And I decided that I wanted to change career. And by that time, I'd taken trouble to marry the young man that I met in the Japanese merchant bank, and he was very, very good at it, and he did love what he did, and so I didn't have to worry about somebody paying for me through my law studies. And that's what I went to do. But at the same time, I was also selected to fight a parliamentary seat in the general elections for our parliament in 1992. So I did that as well. And the seat was for the Conservative Party. It was unwinnable. It was a stronghold for the Labour Party. But after that, I applied for other seats for the next election. And then I had a real dilemma. Do I want to be a lawyer, or do I want to be a politician? Now, I don't know if any of you have got career ideas. Does anybody here actually have a career they have in mind that they've desperately wanted to do since they were 5 years old? One, two, two. You can be brave. You can tell us. We won't ask you what it was.
Yeah, I wanted to be a lawyer.
You wanted to be a lawyer. Are you going to be a lawyer?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
And you still want to be a lawyer. Okay. And you also?
I want to be a film director.
You want to be a film director? Okay. Okay. Well, I hope you both make it if that's what you want. I wanted to be a politician. And I knew Theresa May, our current Prime Minister, and she and I are the same sort of age and have the same similar background. We're both preachers' kids, vicar's daughters. But I fell in love with the law. And I'd had a love affair with politics all of my life, ever since I was really, really small. And turning my back on that was like turning my back on somebody I had loved for maybe 30 years. But I decided the law was where I wanted to be. And so suddenly my life took a completely different trajectory. So I became a barrister. And I'm going to tell you about barristers in England. Does anybody know anything about barristers in England? Advocates, attorneys, what we do? It's a wholly different system from yours. And you can tell me later whether you think ours is better or worse. But here, the people who go into court, and I'll only talk about criminals like me, when we go into court, I'm completely independent and I'm self-employed. And I'm not a public defender and I'm not a public prosecutor. I prosecute and I defend. And every British barrister prosecutes and defends. There are a small group who are employed by the state, but they're not, generally speaking, very well thought of. And there is a small group who will only ever defend on principle. They can prosecute, but they refuse to. But the vast majority of barristers prosecute and defend, and that is a fantastic system. And I'll tell you why it's fantastic. It means that when I stand up in court, because I do both, I know what the tricks are from the other side. I know what the prosecutor will be thinking when I'm defending, because I prosecute. When I prosecute, I know what the defence advocate's thinking, because I defend. I know what all the tricks are. It's a bit like a poacher being a really good gamekeeper, and a gamekeeper being a really good poacher. Secondly, the general public know that if I'm asked, as I often am, to advise on whether maybe a high-profile figure should be charged with sex offences, and that's been a big issue in this country recently, I'm not paid by the state. I'm not in bed with the police. I've got no axe to grind. I'm not a part of the state machinery. So my advice is entirely independent of anybody. Nobody's going to not elect me next time around. Nobody's going to kick me out of my job because I'm self-employed. And at the moment, for example, I'm advising the government, or rather the Director of Public Prosecutions, on whether anybody should be charged in relation to a massive football disaster we had here many years ago, and you may have heard of it. 95 people were killed in a stadium in the north of England, Hillsborough. And after that happened, it was said that the police officers who were on duty that day had all acted to cover up their own failings. And it was said, and has been said ever since 1989, that the police altered their witness testimony, that they suppressed junior police officers who wanted to tell the truth, and so on. And I'm going to spend part of the next 6 months reading this massive amount of paper on this Hillsborough disaster to advise on whether anyone should be charged. I don't work for the police, I don't work for the government, I don't work for the Crown Prosecution Service, and I have no access to grind on either side. I'm wholly independent. So that, in our system, is something that we really, really cherish and we hold very dear indeed. And the same goes for our judges. They are not elected. So a judge can make unpopular decisions. A judge can decide not to send a sex offender to prison for perhaps good reason. Nobody's going to kick him out of office. You can get kicked out of office. I'm only as good as the last piece of work I do, and if it's not great, then maybe nobody will ever give me any work anymore. A judge equally can blot his copybook or her copybook. They can do something so awful, they can be forced to resign. But the point is that nobody has to make decisions which are anything other than their own ethical, professional, considered decisions. They're not based on any form of pressure from anywhere. If I go into a trial to prosecute somebody and I discover from the police that they've got information that might help the defendant, that might show the defendant is actually innocent of the crime, I can say to the officer, you have to disclose that. You just have to. I can't get sacked for doing that, but I can make sure that, that the trial is fair and that the police disclose all the evidence they should disclose. Another example is our system of, you would call it plea bargaining, I think. We have no plea bargaining in this country. So if somebody comes to me, if I'm prosecuting and somebody comes and says, look, we'll plead guilty to causing grievous bodily harm to this person, but you've charged me with attempted murder, and we'll plead guilty to causing grievous bodily harm. We don't plea bargain here. I have no control over what the sentence might be. The police have got no control over the sentence. Only the judge does that. I can say, yes, well, we'll accept your plea, and we'll drop the attempted murder. We won't push that. We'll accept that only you intended to cause really serious harm, but you didn't intend to kill. But I can only do that by following a guideline issued by our Attorney General, and I have to explain to anybody who asks me, including the judge, why it is I accepted that plea. Nothing happens behind closed doors in this country. Nothing happens without it being in open court and recorded. So that's the work that I do. Now I'm going to just tell you about some of the dilemmas that we have, and then later I want to hear about what you think of them and how they compare with what you do in the States. Terrorism. You face a terrorist threat in the States as we do. You had the Twin Towers. You have other threats, not only in your own home country, but all over the world, as do we. And I wonder what any of you think. I spent a lot of time with terrorists. I wonder what any of you think a terrorist really looks like. Most terrorists that I come across are young men, and they are often very clever, but they are normally young men who are misfits, and they're socially outcast, and they don't fit in with anybody, and they are isolated from places. So they're not fierce, violent people who really want to kill. But because, and this is common to so many young men and women, people who are teenagers often do feel very insecure. But because they feel insecure, they are ripe for the plucking. And there are people in the UK, and I'm sure in your own country as well, who go to university campuses and they look out for that young man who is in some way disaffected or left out or not part of a group and not part of a gang, and they will target him. And for a young man who's 17 and 18 and who doesn't fit in, what is he being offered by these people? He's being offered the chance to be part of a team. He's being offered the chance to be part of a group that has an aim in life and a mission. He's being offered the chance to bear arms, to learn how to fire a gun, to shoot it, to kill, to fight. He may be interested in the 70 virgins that he's promised if he manages to blow himself up. But he's being offered all of these opportunities, which for him, and it normally is a him, are just attractive beyond anything you can imagine. So when we talk about the terrorist threat here, what we're trying to combat really, in the main, is these young people who want to go and fight in Syria. They often do go and fight in Syria, and then they sometimes come home, and then they're a danger to us on our island here. And we have various ways of seeking to divert them. We have a program, the Divert program, where young people can be sent into, if they give cause for concern in their schools by expressing radical ideas, they can be sent into this program, and they're given special counselling from their local imams or other specially trained counsellors. And some of them are diverted away from terrorism. Others, sadly, not. How else do we combat it? Well, tell me this, how many people here would be very happy to have a law which allowed the government to access or the law enforcement agencies to access your Facebook accounts, social media, emails, text messaging? Anybody happy with that?
Question, I mean, can't they basically do that already? I mean, I know we had a speaker in here earlier that said basically any private company that's any sort of inclined can just do that immediately.
Right, maybe they can. Maybe they can. But if they do, they're not a law enforcement agency doing it with the permission of, and it's unlawful, presumably.
Right, well,
I don't know.
so I guess if
In
it's a third-party company, wouldn't they be, I guess wouldn't they be allowed to submit some sort of appeal to that company to request it? Because it's not like this is private information for the user, it's information stored by the company on the company's site.
Yeah, now it's interesting you say that because Facebook, for example, Facebook store this information on their servers. When we in the UK ask Facebook to give that to us because we want it, because we suspect there'll be terrorist communications there, Facebook always blank us, they always refuse. They won't do it because it's contrary to your constitution. So we have a real problem with Facebook here.
How is that contrary to our Constitution?
Ask Facebook. I don't know, but it is. Facebook are a real problem. So we can only get information from Facebook by taking screenshots from people's computers when it's actually there. But we have laws that prevent law enforcement agencies from getting hold of from listening into your phone traffic, for example. And I think you probably have the same laws. Here it's very controversial because the law enforcement agencies want to be able to tap everybody's phones and email accounts and WhatsApp and Snapchat and Facebook and everything else. But there are real issues about invading privacy. And that's why I'm asking you the question about whether you'd be happy for the FBI, for example, or CIA, just have any access they wanted to any communication that you send.
They kind of already do in some senses with the Patriot Act. I mean, there's some provisions under that that allow the United States government to go in, and there's secret tribunals that convene where a judge can rule that
Right.
this is okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so,
Okay.
And the NSA, I mean, Edward Snowden blew it all out of the water, but I mean, for a while they were tapping quite a bit of our communications and looking for hot words that would come up.
Everybody's communications or just specific people who had been authorized?
Note he said secret tribunals
Yeah.
rather than everybody.
Okay, so secret
So
tribunals.
Even though there were secret tribunals, it's still not carte blanche.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
So there must be some judicial control? Is there a judge sitting in the secret? Okay, now we have secret tribunals. People call them secret courts. And in this country, there's a kind of feeling that we have these secret courts that meet maybe late at night and nobody knows about them and they're lit up by candles and awful things get decided in these secret courts. You know, read some of our more left-wing newspapers and you find that being suggested. We do have secret courts, rather as you've just described. They are mostly held in order to deal with this situation. I don't know if you have something similar, where the security services, MI5 and our MI6, your CIA equivalent, know, because they've got information, intelligence coming from spies or from maybe ordinary people who are just sneaking the information into them, they know that this young man, we'll call him Ahmed or John, they know that there's a strong reason to think that he is planning a terrorist attack on the mainland here in Britain. And the trouble is that the security services don't have enough evidence to bring him to court. They can't present it to me and say, prosecute him, because all of this information they've got has come to them through secret sources, through informants, spies, whoever. And they can never say that those people will never come into court and say it openly because they could be killed. So what are we going to do to contain this threat? Because this guy, John, is a serious threat, according to what MI6 know. So what we do here is we have a system called TPIMS, where John can effectively be put under house arrest, and he can be put under a load of conditions. He can't leave the house except at certain times. He has to wear an electronic tag. He can't use the internet except to speak to particular people. He can only use a specially authorized telephone to speak to people that he's authorized to speak to, and so on. But those measures can only be put in place after the Secretary of State, who used to be Theresa May, goes to a High Court judge. She doesn't go personally, someone like me goes, and explains why it is that we need to have these measures. But it has to be done in secret, because John can never know who it is who's saying these things about him. On the other hand, it's a bit unfair, isn't it, if John doesn't get to hear what's being said, because the security services may be saying, well, we've got information that John is meeting some really, 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 dangerous terrorist. John may say, well, that's my uncle, of course I'm meeting him. He's my mum's brother. There may be an innocent reason. So it's quite unfair, isn't it, if John doesn't know what's being said, because his liberty is being severely curtailed. So our system here is to have people called special counsel, and I'm a special counsel. There are about 100 of us, and we're again appointed by the Attorney General. And we are entrusted with being told what the security services are saying about John, and we're also told by John's own attorneys what John's position is. You can never tell John what the security service is telling you, but I can go to a judge and say, look, seems to me, Judge, that this is quite unfair because the security services say this. On the other hand, if John were asked about it, he might say this. So we have this middle counsel, but when the counsel does it, we have no client on either side. We're purely alone, but we're there to act as the advocate for John. And that's how we get around the problem, our secret courts. We have other ways of doing it. You can have a spy from MI6 who'll come to court with a bag over his head, almost, and he does it under a false name, and he or she can explain to the judge what it is, what the secret information is that gives them such cause for concern. So that's how we tread this very difficult line. And I'm sure you have similar provisions in the States to do the same thing. Because our big dilemma here is how we ensure our security on one hand against this very serious threat, but our liberty on the other hand. And most of us here, as I'm sure with you, would prefer, in fact, that people get blown up than that we give up our liberties, at least that we give up our liberties wholesale. Of course, we can all give up our liberties. We can all go back to the days of having identification cards and being asked to wander around the streets and produce them at will to any police officer who asks you. None of us in the United Kingdom want to see that system ever. But we have to try to tread a fine line. So we do have secret courts, but they're not quite as secret as some people might care to think that they are. So that is terrorism and some of the problems that we're using to try to combat it. We have a lot of success here in averting terrorist threats, as do you. And so far, we haven't had a major terrorist atrocity in this country since, I think, the July the 7th attacks, which were about 5 years ago. But we have to be vigilant. Now, other things that I do, I could tell you about my job forever if you wanted me to, but I think we're going to need to have time for some questions and also to maybe to go to the bar before we have dinner. So, murder. Other dilemmas that we have in cases, and one of the other reasons why we have independent advocates is because we have systems here whereby the advocate's duty is always to the court. And as a prosecutor, my first duty isn't to make sure the guy gets convicted. My first duty is to ensure that the trial is a fair one. And it doesn't matter what the judge says, because some of our judges really are quite keen to get the guy potted. And it doesn't matter what the judge says, it doesn't matter what the police officers say, doesn't matter what the Crown Prosecution Service say. The prosecution advocate is there to ensure that the trial is fair beyond anything, to ensure that any information the police have got that might help the guy in the dock is given to him and to his counsel, to make sure that if witnesses are available who might help the defendant, we have to make sure that they're made available and are brought to court. We hear terrible things, I have to tell you. I've got to tell you about the States and your system of criminal justice. And perhaps you're all going to tell me that what we hear is wrong and that we shouldn't believe what we read in novels by John Grisham and in the newspapers. Right, there we go. Is it true?
Some of it.
Okay. For example, if you're charged with murder in the United States of America, if you're charged with murder, who pays for your legal costs? Who?
Is it the taxpayers?
The taxpayers. Okay. Does that apply to everybody across the board?
No.
No.
Well, you can defend yourself privately, or you can get a public defender.
Okay. And the public defenders are generally...
Wildly overworked and underpaid.
Right, that's what we hear, wildly overworked and underpaid. I think our defenders here would say they're overworked and underpaid, but they're not.
With a
Not to that
perhaps touch of indifference also.
Okay. The defenders have a touch of indifference.
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe due to the
Say it again?
maybe due to the overworking and underpaying.
Yeah, maybe due to that.
A lot of times they meet their defendant on the first day of their arraignment. The judge just will look out to the audience of lawyers and the family in the audience and go, would anybody like to represent this man? And the public defender will draw a number and they're...
And they'll go and do it.
And before even shaking the person's hand, they have to represent them at their arraignment, so.
And the public defender, and is the arraignment at the beginning of the trial? Or is there then an adjournment for months before the trial starts?
Yes, the arraignments, it can be anywhere from a month to, I mean, almost a year sometimes.
Okay, so there's a bit of time after that to meet and take some
Yeah, between the arraignment
information.
and the trial.
Okay. And the public defenders, are they just paid a salary or are they paid per case?
Salary.
They're paid a salary, whether they work or not. So they can put their feet up, really.
If they don't work though, I mean, they have to continue to
Yeah,
put in
to-
their
to
time,
defend.
the hours, but yeah,
Okay.
they can't just put their feet up. I mean, these
Okay.
guys are working.
And would you say that the people who choose to be public defenders are generally the brightest and best of American?
No.
Scrambling to get out of it.
Okay. Is it a job that may be seen in America as being something that people do if they can't get into one of the big law firms?
It's more of a starting job for a lot of, right out
Okay.
of law school, you
Okay.
become a public defender, or an ADA.
Right. And then perhaps seek to go into a law firm later on?
Yep, after you learn
Okay.
the tricks of the trade.
Right. Here, it is a glamorous job, seen as being glamorous. Not by the big commercial barristers who earn millions every year putting together arbitration and mergers and acquisitions and so on, but in the criminal bar world, the great public defenders for centuries, and you read about them in books, they are seen as being glamorous. They are seen as being people to aspire to be. And while we're all paid by the public purse, and so it's not necessarily a king's ransom, you can make a very good living out of doing it. But it has a lot of kudos here to be a defender. But we are not, as I told you earlier, we're not public defenders or public prosecutors. Most of us are independent. We do have a public defender service here. It was launched about 5 years ago because I think the government would quite like us to have your system and they'd quite like to smash the independent bar. But the only people who volunteered to join the public defender service here were barristers who had no work at all because they are so useless. And nobody wanted to instruct them to defend anybody. And so anybody here who ends up with a public defender really has drawn a very short straw. So here, anybody in custody can choose any barrister that they want. They can go onto a website, they can have anybody, and the state will pay. And once upon a time, anybody charged with murder would always guaranteed to have a Queen's Counsel and a junior. Today, that doesn't happen quite to the same extent anymore, but most of the time, they'll be given a Queen's Counsel and a junior of their choice. They can go online, they can look on the websites, they can talk to their other friends in prison, they can ask, and they can have whoever they want. And we have a rule here. If we are asked, if I get a phone call or my clerks say to me, Miss Whitehouse, there's a solicitor wants you to go and defend this guy. He may be the most notorious murderer. I cannot refuse it. We're not allowed to refuse unless we have already got other work booked in for that same date. It's called our cab rank rule, and we are duty bound to accept that work. And that means that even somebody who's charged with the most appalling rapes of children, the most appalling murders, our maxim is that somebody must always be prepared to stand between the state and the citizen. Somebody must always be prepared to speak for the citizen. And if you are one of the best barristers in the country, one of the top barristers, and you're asked to do it, you have to go and do it. You can't turn it down. So that's how we preserve, I think, what is a very fine criminal justice system. Yeah.
Are there any other exceptions to the rule that you would have to take on, even if you are free, or there's no other exception?
The only exception is if in some way you might be professionally embarrassed. So supposing I had some involvement in the decision to charge the guy and then I was asked to defend him, I could say, well, I can't because I was on the other side. Or if somebody's offered a job like that, but they don't feel they're of sufficient seniority, so somebody who has sort of 2 years qualification may say, well, I can't properly defend in this really quite difficult murder case. Or if the fee being offered is not a proper fee, but legal aid rates are deemed to be, recently deemed to be a proper fee. So no, otherwise there is no, or you're booked up already.
Wouldn't that interfere a lot with like personal ethics? Just because like if you had someone who completely came up to you and like admitted to like committing like a murder or something.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, and you're like, oh, okay, well, I have to defend you.
No,
You know,
no. If somebody comes, it's a classic thing. We're always asked, how can you defend somebody you know is guilty? If somebody tells me that they're guilty, then I can't defend them. And the reason for that is I can't go into court and say something which I know to be untrue. I can't go and say to a jury, you know, he's not guilty because, if he's told me he is. So if that happens, you have to say, I can't defend you, and you have to go and find another barrister. And by the way, don't tell them that you're guilty, because then they won't be misleading the court if they go into court and say he's not guilty. I did have a guy once who I defended on a charge of murder, and he was convicted. And I was a bit worried about that, because I wasn't sure he was guilty, actually. It was a knifing, and he said he'd acted in self-defense. But I'm pleased to say that when I went down to the cells, and I'm not giving anywhere confidentiality here, because you don't know him, and I'm not giving you the name, or I'm not telling you even when it was. When I went down to the cells, he said, by the way, Sarah, I have to tell you I've been lying to you for the past 3 months, because actually what happened was this. And he then told me that, in fact, he knifed the guy deliberately, and he really was very guilty of murder, which made me feel better. Because I was going to appeal his case for him, because I was so convinced he might be innocent. So, no, if somebody says they're guilty, then you can't represent them. That's true. Otherwise, no exceptions.
Could you go, you've spoken of public fees and public funding and private. How are barristers compensated?
We are paid for each case that we do. And if we're paid privately, then our clerks will negotiate the fee with the person who's paying. They have a solicitor. We have a solicitor. A solicitor instructs us on behalf of the client. So we have this split between barristers and solicitors, which you don't have. You have a fused profession, I think, don't you? So if it's a privately paying client, then it's a matter of negotiation. If it's paid by the state, if it's legally aided, and everybody's entitled to legal aid in this country, if people are very rich, then they have to make a contribution to it themselves. And that system keeps on changing depending on how much money the government's got to put into it. But basically, if you're publicly funded and defending, the fee is fixed. There's a fixed scale of fees, and it's based upon how serious the charge is. So there's a particular rate for a case for a murder compared with a shoplifting, and then it depends on how many pages of evidence there are in the case. And there's a formula, and it depends on how many witnesses there are and how many days the case lasts. And there's a formula for each of these, and the clerks put in the numbers, and out comes the final number. But so for public funded work, legally aided work, or state prosecuting, and there's very little private prosecuting in this country, it's all paid on a fixed scale. That's agreed by the government and the Bar Council every few years. Recently, it's been very controversial because the fees were frozen for 7 years and then cut by 30% because we've had this austerity government here because we were basically broke. So everybody had to take a big cut in their funding. But it's fixed across the board. Privately paying, doesn't matter, up to the client. If they don't want me, then the clerks will negotiate it.
Earlier you spoke about plea bargaining. In the United States, if we didn't have plea bargaining, our courts would be backlogged for centuries. How do you deal with that and not really having the same plea bargaining that the U.S. does in terms of keeping your laws?
That's an interesting question, because our courts do have a backlog. But normally, if you're charged with murder today, we have a time limit that you can be kept in custody for. And that time limit, and you probably have the same thing, I'm not sure, but that time limit can be extended, but only if a judge agrees to extend it. And the prosecution have got to show that they've acted with all due diligence in putting the case together. And the time limit is 180 days. So most of our murder trials come to trial within 6 months of the person being charged.
It's a lot quicker than
Yeah.
us.
Yeah. And yet we don't have your plea bargaining.
Yeah.
Here, we've streamlined everything. People are expected to come to court on day one, knowing how the client's going to plead. The prosecution have got to serve papers within 42 days. All of their evidence has to be served. There's now a really strict timetable that has to be obeyed. But we've spent about 20 years working this out and agonising over this. And today, it's pretty streamlined. But we still run out of court time. There's still no courts available. Trials can overrun. But I think also, I know because I've often had American pupils in my chambers who've come and spent 6 months with me, including one, Jessica de Grazia, who was quite a controversial DA in America, I think, and done a lot of advisory work here. And I'm told that in your criminal trials, nothing is ever agreed. Evidence has got to be called of every single little piece of evidence, whereas here, great swathes of things are agreed. It'll be agreed that this house existed, and this is the plan of the house, and these are the photographs of the house, and here's the photograph of the dead body, and the dead person was this person, and all of that is agreed. And the real issue is, well, okay, it's even agreed that this person, my current trial, this woman killed this man. There's no doubt about that. The question is why she did it. So everything's agreed.
Things can be stipulated. Of course.
You have stipulations.
And yes, that can happen in the American
Yeah.
system. But there's one factor that discourages it in the United States and encourages it here.
Which is?
American attorneys are paid by the hour.
Right. Okay. Well, yes. We're not. So, I mean, it can be bad here if somebody pleads at the door of the court, because you can then be unemployed for, expecting a 3-week trial. There's a plea at the door of the court, you're out of work for 3 weeks. I'd love that to happen. People don't plead guilty to murder and terrorism, so I no longer have that. But any other questions?
What the role of the barrister that you described is a little less polarizing than the role of the U.S. attorney, which is very aggravating to the point where, they might actually misrepresent something to the court, or don't have to divulge things that the client can pass to that other. I'm wondering where that lies in the gradation of an expert witness that might serve for one side or the other. You talked about your role as ensuring that the process is fair. And when I've served as an expert witness, I viewed my role as very different in that I should testify pretty much the same way no matter which side
Absolutely.
hired me.
Because your duty is to the court. It's
And-
exactly the same here. Yeah. The expert witness has a duty to the court, and most of our expert witnesses probably like you. What's your field?
Financial economics.
Right. And you're often instructed for both sides? Do you?
Correct.
Yeah, as here. And so you can never be asked to change your evidence. You can never...
I've been asked.
You've been asked, really?
Oh, sure.
Right. Okay. If somebody ever accused me of asking an expert witness to change his testimony, I'd throw myself out of a window. I mean, it would be so unethical in this country. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm sure it does. I'm sure it does. But yeah, no, like you, their first duty, and they sign a declaration at the end of their witness statements or their reports to say, my first duty is to the court, and I understand that, and I am unbiased, totally
It
unbiased.
would be a wonderful statement for our experts. I don't think, I've never signed that. That would be
Right, yeah. Well, I'll show you the declaration.
It brings up another point. I mean, the first duty to the courts. You asked a question yesterday, Mike, about when a client's interest comes into conflict with society's interest. We were talking about what a profession is. Was that your question? And so, I mean, your answer is that the profession, at least in this case, their interests supersede the process, or it's really society's interests, right?
PII, Sarah?
Yeah, PII, exactly. Well, public interest immunity, that's an element of it. I mean, I was going to talk about ethics this evening, actually, but I heard that you had talked about ethics last night, so I thought we wouldn't have any more ethics. But of course, you can't talk about your profession without touching on ethics, because it's the most important part of the job. PII is where you have some information, but you can't divulge it to anyone because somebody might get killed if you do. Life could be at stake, or It could be a police informant who has told the police, maybe I'm prosecuting a man for murder, and this really reliable informant tells a police officer, no, you've got the wrong guy, it wasn't him, I know who it was some other guy. I can't divulge that, because if I did, it might reveal the name of the informant, and if it was known he was a police grass, then his life could be in danger. So then that's public interest immunity. But really we rarely have this issue anymore, because if there is information that might help a defendant and might show he was innocent, then you have to find a way of disclosing it in some shape or form. You might even have to make a stipulation that the police have received information that somebody else committed the murder. And that can be deployed by the defendant. We have to find a way of doing it. And if we really can't reveal anything, then we have to drop the case. Because better that a murderer goes, or a potential murderer goes free, than that there's a trial which is unfair, and that you've held on to information which could help him. So that's part of the ethical code. Never mislead the court. Never assist in a crime. I mean, there's masses of it. We have something we call the blush test. If you're presented with a dilemma and you think this doesn't sound quite right, could you tell your father about it? Could you tell a High Court judge about it without colouring up? Because if you're going to blush when you realise what you did, then you shouldn't be doing it. That's the test I give to my pupils. Tends to work okay most of the time. Has done for me.
Fortunately.
Time for a drink.
I'm not sure we're going to have time for a drink.
Right, time for dinner.
However, there will be a drink sitting at your place when you get to the table.
I can wait that long, I'm sure.
I don't know about you guys, but I would be perfectly willing to sit here for another 2 hours and talk with Sarah, or listen, better yet, listen to Sarah Hall. This is absolutely, totally fascinating. I wish we had another 2 hours for this. Thank you so much.
Great pleasure.